Hello everyone, welcome back to Sasson's Corner, your number one YouTube channel. Now, on today's episode, guys, I'm going to be continuing with my series focusing on football, and today we are looking at, in particular, the Zimbabwe Football Association and the upcoming elections in 2022. So I'm basically going to be focusing on the significance of these elections. We're going to be looking at the history of ZIFA, as well as past presidents. We're looking at the current state of ZIFA, and also, the candidates, the guys who are going to be contesting for the 2022 election. Right. So like I said, today we're focusing on ZIFA. ZIFA is basically an abbreviation which stands for the Zimbabwe Football Association. This is the mother body that runs football in Zimbabwe. ZIFA was formed in 1979. It became a member of CAF, which is the Confederation of African Football, in 1980. It joined COSAFA, which is the Council of Southern African Football, in 1997. Okay, and then so what happens with ZIFA is that every 4 years, the Zimbabwe Football Association holds an election to choose a chairman or a president, whichever you like. And the process of choosing this president is that they have 58 councillors. This is basically the guys who have the power to vote. So what it means is you and I, or any Johnny on the street, once basically elected into power. The ZIFA president obviously works with a team which is basically the ZIFA board. This is made up of 10 members. Now, the first 8 members, these are voted for by the ZIFA councillors. Like I said, that is the president, his deputy, and 6 board members. These are basically voted. So what happens with the other 2? The other 2 are basically the chairman of the Premier Soccer League, as well as the leader of Zimbabwe, or the chairperson of women's football in Zimbabwe. So they automatically get onto the board by virtue of being the leaders of their constituents, which is the Premier Soccer League. Over the years, ZIFA has had some rather colorful and somewhat controversial figures who have led the association. In the 90s, we had individuals such as the likes of Mr. Trevor Carol-Sejul. He led ZIFA during the early 90s. This was during the period of the Dream Team, right? This was the team, of course, led by Reinhard Fabish. And Mr. Carol-Sejul, he didn't really finish his term because he ended up having to leave his job under very controversial circumstances. He was accused of some criminal activities. He ended up not only leaving his post as ZIFA president, but he actually fled the country, went to South Africa, where he became a very successful businessman. Later returned to the country after a very long time, tried to run again for ZIFA president, but eventually lost out to Over the years, we've also had the likes of Mr. Rafiq Khan, who also left the job under some controversial circumstances because he was actually sent to prison because of a criminal case, which was from way back when, where he was accused of having broken into a car and something like that and stolen some items. The story only came up some years later when he was now ZIFA president. He was actually sent to prison. He was supposed to serve 16 years, but only served 3 years. So unfortunately enough for him, he never even finished his term. I think he actually served about just 2 to 3 years. Over the years, we've also had Leo Mugabe, who is the nephew of former President Mr. Robert Mugabe. He is one of the longest serving ZIFA presidents, but it's fair to say one of the least successful because Zimbabwe never really achieved anything under his leadership. Probably the only significant thing Zimbabwe ever achieved was probably winning the COSAFA Castle Cup. You then also had a very controversial figure by the name of Mr. Cuthbert Dube. Now, under Mr. Dube's leadership, Zimbabwe experienced probably its darkest period because that's when we had the whole Asiagate match-fixing scandal, which involved Mr. Dube. Obviously, he had to be involved being the ZIFA president, as well as Henrietta Rushwaya, who at the time was the CEO of Zimbabwean football. And basically, the CEO is the one responsible for the day-to-day running of the organization. And during this time, Zimbabwe was embroiled in a very nasty match-fixing scandal, which led to several individuals being banned. Some received lengthy bans, some were banned for life. Some people even had criminal cases opened up against them, including the likes of Henrietta Rushwaya, but she was later acquitted. Nothing ever really stuck. During Mr. Dube's rule as well, you remember that that's when Zimbabwe was sanctioned by FIFA. We couldn't take part in the 2018 World Cup qualifiers. Why? Because ZIFA was owing the then national team coach, a Brazilian by the name of Mr. Valinos, an amount up to about around $60,000. Mr. Valinos went and reported ZIFA to the World Football Governing Body, which is FIFA, and FIFA sanctioned Zimbabwe, and we ended up, being banned from taking part in the 2018 World Cup. Another colorful figure who has also led Zimbabwean football is none other than some call him the doctor, some call him honorable, or as he prefers to call himself, he's the self-proclaimed god of Zimbabwean football. That is Mr. Philip Chiangwa. Now, Mr. Chiangwa led ZIFA from around 2014, 2015 to around 2018 when he lost the election to the current ZIFA president, who's Mr. Fulton Kamambo. Now, it's important to note that under Mr. Chiangwa's leadership, it's fair to say that Zimbabwe did achieve a relative amount of success in the sense that we qualified for the African Cup of Nations in 2017. We also won the COSAFA Castle Cup under Mr. Chiangwa's leadership. And also under Mr. Chiangwa's leadership, it's important to note that we also avoided being sanctioned from taking part in the 2022 World Cup qualifiers. Why? Because we also had another coach, a Belgian coach by the name of Mr. Tom Seinfeld, who actually reported Zimbabwe to FIFA because they were owing him unpaid salaries to the amount of around about 160,000 US dollars. And under Mr. Chiangwa's leadership, he was able to arrange a payment plan which ended up satisfying Mr. Seinfeld as well as FIFA. And in the end, FIFA allowed us to participate in the 2022 World Cup qualifiers. So you might ask yourself, why do people even want to, contest for this position? Why are people so interested? In fact, when you look at most of these people, you find that these are very successful businessmen and wealthy people in their own right. Why are they so interested in taking over such a seemingly dysfunctional organization? Very simple. Being ZIFA president is a position that wields a lot of power and influence. By virtue of becoming ZIFA president, you automatically get onto the board of COSAFA, or basically you have voting rights within COSAFA, and you can actually contest to become COSAFA president, which explains why Mr. Philip Chiangwa is the current president of COSAFA, which is, a bit fishy considering that he's no longer the president of Zimbabwean football. Also, by virtue of that, you can also contest to become president of CAF. Why? Because you also have voting powers within CAF. And also, obviously, once you are within the corridors of power within CAF, that allows you also to enter the corridors of power within FIFA. So by virtue of, getting to those stages, you can actually contest to become FIFA president one day. And you find that once you become a ZIFA president, you mingle with the who's who of be it African football, world football, international football, not to mention politics and business. So in the 40 years that ZIFA has existed, you'll find that Zimbabwe has not really achieved anything to write home about, except for qualifying for 4 African Cup of Nations and winning the COSAFA Castle Cup 6 times, and until recently our women's national team qualifying for the Olympics. I'm sure the Zimbabwe Olympic Committee will probably also want to take credit for that. So you find that in the last 40 years, we haven't really achieved much. And considering the amount of talent that the country has produced, one definitely feels that by now we should have at least gone far, be it in the African Cup of Nations, or we should have at least qualified for the World Cup. So once again, this is the significance of the next ZIFA election. Are the ZIFA councillors this time around going to actually choose someone who has the best interest of Zimbabwean football at heart? Or is it just a case of choosing, or electing another figure who, once they get into office, we hear of, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of US dollars that go missing? Is it going to be the same story of having our national team whenever they travel? You have players complaining of not being paid their bonuses. Is it always going to be the issue of matches being fixed, players receiving envelopes under the table? Is it going to be the same story of having, mashef who travel whenever the national team travels, and then you hear of women being booked into hotel rooms and so forth, and, yet you have supporters, genuine supporters, and players who are not being paid what is due to them. So this is the significance of the next ZIFA election. So, which brings us to the issue of who is actually contesting, the next ZIFA election. So you find that right now we have the current president, who's Mr. Fulton Kamambo. Like I said, he took over in 2018. You also have a lady by the name of Ellen Chiwenga. She's also contesting the ZIFA presidency, as well as a former Zimbabwean international and a former prominent soccer star by the name of Mr. Alius Bunjira. He's also contesting the election. These are the current 3 candidates at the moment. 2022 is still a while away, so we might have other people who might actually decide to join in the race. So as I continue with my series over the next few episodes, I will be focusing on these candidates and just shedding a bit more light on what these people have to offer.